So, we are very fortunate to have Anne Coombs with us. Anne is an acclaimed author, a hugely experienced and respected journalist, an activist of some note, was a founder, one of the founders of Get Up and a chair there for a time. Anne, possibly imprudently, has encouraged me in my endeavours. But no, seriously, Anne is a fantastic thinker, and I've been very drawn to her writing for some time, and it's excellent that Anne has given some of her time today to speak to us on the theme of what is government for? An excellent question. Please welcome Anne Coombs.
Can I close that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so what are governments for? I mean, this is actually a serious question. They're not just there to be a pain in the bum. They do actually have a role. It's very easy to be cynical about the role of government, or more particularly about the politicians who make up the parliament. As political debate spirals in ever-diminishing circles, many of us are left tearing our hair out in frustration. Why are they so timid? So incapable of using power well? It's as if government, that mechanism created to organise things, has decided that the one thing it cannot do is organise. Instead of planning for the future, protecting things of national importance, adapting to the many challenges facing the world, our politicians are burying their heads in the sand, still playing the old games and mouthing the same platitudes. As Marx says, disruption is everywhere except politics. We have become accustomed to hearing politicians talk about an acceptable range of subjects in an acceptable way. It has led to a narrowing of political discussion and political vision, and the result is that most people simply switch off, and who can blame them? Of course, people have always complained about their governments, but the level of dissatisfaction now suggests a deeper malaise. In democratic societies, the power of governments is said to come from us, yet the real influence of voters in setting a course for the future is minimal. There's a growing realisation that much of the power we have given them has been handed over to corporate interests. The selling off of public assets is part of this, but not the most insidious. Government subsidies to the fossil fuel companies at a time when the rest of the world is turning away from coal makes no sense, yet we seem powerless to stop it. Then there are the former politicians who go to work for energy companies or become lobbyists for major companies or major industries. Similarly corrosive are the donations to political parties, so that some MPs enter Parliament already under an obligation to outside interests. And then there are the trade agreements. So intent have successive governments of both persuasions been in providing a level playing field for imports that many of our own companies have been bowled out of the game. We live in a world where the most basic of products, pencils, light bulbs, travel the globe to get to us. And this at a time when we're supposed to be worried about our carbon footprint. It's not just sentimentality that makes people hanker for a country that actually makes stuff. It's a gut feeling that there's something not quite right in being so removed from the production of our daily needs. Perhaps even a sense of vulnerability that people feel at a visceral level. Yet our political leaders fail to give it credence. If it's not the role of government to look after our interests, then what are governments for? One job is to stop us tearing ourselves apart, to help organise society in a way that ensures its smooth functionality. There are certain fundamentals that we lay at government's door: protecting the weak from the strong, defending citizens against aggressors. These then require other things of government: promoting understanding, evening out inequality, enacting treaties with neighbours. Governments are required to encourage economic activity because that impacts on the well-being of citizens. They have to ensure basic needs are met for food, shelter, clothing, and for that people need jobs and income. We have given government a great deal of power in order to have these basic requirements met. The power to tax is the most often talked about and enacted, and it's fundamental. Without it, they can do nothing. But with that comes the responsibility to plan. Planning not just for today or the next 3 years, but for prosperity into the future. And that is something that Australian governments have not been very good at. Even getting the basic infrastructure right seems to be beyond us, evident in the transport and urban planning nightmares that are our major cities. This wasn't always the case. The designers of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the 1920s showed remarkable degree of forethought. Its 8 lanes must have seemed enormous in 1932. It took 70 years to pay off the Harbour Bridge debt, a public asset, publicly built and paid for. The next time government took on something so ambitious was Labor's plan for the National Broadband Network. And what a mess that turned into once it became a political football. The Turnbull government talked a great deal about transitioning, but what did it mean? In hindsight, nothing. Having signed the Paris climate deal, it then failed to put in place policies that would reduce greenhouse emissions. Now the Morrison government continues to sprout that we will meet our Paris targets at a canter, against plentiful evidence that greenhouse emissions have actually increased. This reality vacuum, the disjunction between rhetoric and action, is becoming increasingly common. It doesn't have to be this way. Other countries make decisions about the kind of economic development that will be of benefit to them and introduce policies that will actually make it happen. South Korea with the steel and car industries, for example. Spain with renewable energy. But in Australia, our governments live in a neoliberal fantasy world where the market is expected to do it. The renewables industry in Spain is a good example of the influence that government policy can have. In the early 2000s, the Spanish government actively encouraged the renewable energy sector, and Spain became a world leader. Then after the GFC, austerity measures meant that, much like here, the subsidies that the industry was relying on in order to grow were removed. While wind expanded, solar stagnated. But even with the government in retreat, renewables still grew to supply 50% of Spain's renewable power requirements. And now the push is on to kick-start it again. 3 months ago, Spain announced it would be 100% renewable by 2050. Australia could be doing this, and we should have been doing it for a decade or more. It is this, not just inaction, but antagonism towards renewables that is most frustrating. It's said that the principal reason for the coalition's attitude is the donations it receives from the fossil fuel industry. Could it be as simple and blatant as that? Probably, yeah. And what of the Murray-Darling Basin? Why does the National Party seem most concerned to pander to the interests of the big agribusiness irrigators? Could it be the same reason? The National Party has long since lost the right to see itself as defender of the battlers of the bush. The Water Act of 2007 might have saved the river, but it has been chipped away at by vested interests until now we have what we have seen these past weeks with the fish kills. We should not be growing rice or cotton on the scale we are in this country, and a government with guts would put an end to it. But politicians with no interest beyond the next election seem to care little for the environmental legacy they are leaving. The shortness of the federal election cycle. It's one of the reasons we are getting such inept governance. A referendum to establish fixed 4-year terms should be a priority. And a couple of years ago, both Turnbull and Shorten said that they would support it. But that seems to have gone off the agenda. Because no government can plan or implement good policy with an election every 2 or 3 years. One of the reasons I believe that the major parties get away with what they get away with is that our attention has become atomised. We go into bat for particular issues: saving the Great Barrier Reef, protecting inner city neighbourhoods from motorways, stopping Adani, a fair go for asylum seekers, all important issues. Meanwhile, the runaway train that leads to the future careens on, driverless, and its carriages are filled with those millions of Australians who have very little say about how their lives are going to unfold, who are just getting by. Government should be driving that train. But the attention of governments have become atomised as well, with the hundreds of thousands of details involved in running an administration and trying to run an economy. So the dots that make the big picture don't get joined. Public outrage may sway decisions, but not the big picture. What, for example, is happening to our cities? Rapid population growth, unaffordable housing, congested roads, and fraying social cohesion. Refugees become the scapegoats when these problems have very little to do with them. Rather, government policy that has allowed hundreds of thousands of new arrivals to come on business visas or dodgy working visas or student visas, that's encouraged an education sector to become a factory for processing overseas students. Sometimes fraudulently, often through tin pot institutions. That has allowed Sydney and Melbourne to become the real estate bolt hole for wealthy overseas buyers. All this has been going on under our noses these past 15 years with no consultation between government and the Australian people. Since 2000, Melbourne's population has grown by a third, Sydney's by a quarter. At this rate, both cities will grow by about 1 million people per decade. And both cities, of course, attract the bulk of migrants coming from Asia. Immigration from Asia is driving economic and population growth. Yet neither state nor federal governments have been prepared to meet the challenge of being a high immigration society, preferring to safeguard the precious AAA credit rating rather than spend on necessary infrastructure. The result is leading to urban sprawl and unlivable cities. And it is leading to cities that working people cannot afford to live in. Australian governments have put housing in the too hard basket, allowing profiteers and cashed up overseas buyers to exert the kind of influence that it's the job of government to counteract. When government is working well, you barely notice it. And we've been lucky in this country that's quite often been the case. But what is so dismaying at the moment is that we can all see around us things that need to be done. Some serious policies to tackle climate change and the degradation of our environment, saving our rivers, providing affordable homes, and a modern and efficient and comprehensive rail network. Yet these things are not being done. Historically, it has been the role of Australian governments to think about national development. Not only grand projects like the Snowy Mountains scheme or the Harbour Bridge, or less successful ventures like the Ord River scheme, but to take responsibility for the basic functioning of an isolated world that was challenging, diverse, and grew at an extraordinary rate. And the growth has been extraordinary. The achievements in not much more than 200 years have been considerable. So why now is dissatisfaction so high? Some possibilities. Growing inequality, the vast disparities in income, is shaking the sense of a common bond. The evidence that governments are in hock to corporate interests, that they no longer control the agenda, even as they pretend to. The collapse of trust and respect, because the idea of public service seems to have disappeared from the political lexicon. We don't believe they're in there to further the long-term interests of the country. A genuine conversation about the best way forward, for example, some honesty about the costs and benefits of continuing to rely on imported goods, might rebalance national priorities. Yes, we are part of a complex web of international trade obligations, but that hasn't prevented other countries from developing their homegrown industries. So I applaud Mark's call for a national industry policy. The constant refrain has always been that Australia is too small to sustain industries producing primarily for the local market. But that argument becomes more hollow the bigger we get. We are no longer a small country, and in terms of exports, we are very close to some very large populations. A couple of 100 years from now, people may look back and shake their heads at the very idea that ships were used to carry woolen jumpers to the country that had the finest wool on earth. What we are seeing on multiple fronts is a failure to plan and implement policies for the future. That is what governments are for. And this failure on the environment, on transport, on energy policy, on housing, the list goes on, this failure is one of the principal reasons that people are so dissatisfied with government. The recent survey that found that satisfaction levels had dropped from over 80% to less than 40% in a decade was seen as people being unhappy with democracy as a form of government. But what those surveyed were expressing was their unhappiness with the current state of our politics, unhappiness with the perverted form of democracy that we currently have, whereby candidates are selected by a tiny handful of people in the major parties, and we are then expected to vote for them. And when they get into Parliament, they take far more notice of party bosses and big donors than they do of their constituents, or even of their consciences. What started in the 1980s as privatisation of government-owned enterprises has now become wholesale corporatisation, not just of government services or the economy, but of the way we live our lives in the age of Facebook, Google, Netflix, etc., Apple. Simultaneously, and partly in reaction, many of us are trying to dig a small, quiet corner to call our own, fighting global homogenisation with the intensely local activism, local enterprise, local food, locally generated power. And no one does that better than here in Mullumbimby. Because although we live a lot of our lives in cyberspace, the rest of the time we are definitely anchored somewhere. And that tie to place is the most human part of us. It's not a sign of extreme nationalism or redneck patriotism to have a connection to and affection for one's country. But for many people on the left, the idea of loving Australia has become something almost embarrassing. The only people who are admired and respected for love of country are Indigenous. In white Australians, it is often equated with xenophobia, reactionary politics and brutish behaviour. Talking about what our country needs in any kind of all-embracing way is something that right-wingers do, rednecks. It's code, and the left has accepted that code and has vacated the field. There's a reluctance on the left to argue for a vision of what this country can be, and it means we end up having no vision at all. It's all very well to be sceptical about politicians with vision, but on both a personal and a public level, without a dream, you end up going around in circles. One of the things that is heartening in what Mark is trying to do with Together is putting the idea of our commonwealth front and centre stage. He's not just tinkering around the edges with a few policy ideas and pet projects. He's trying to reimagine and rebalance what government can and should be doing for us. Much that is wrong with our current situation, I believe, can be laid at the door of that great god, competition, that neoliberal talisman. We need to reassert the value of public institutions and public ownership and public service and insist that politicians stop seeing us as consumers and start seeing us as citizens. Thank you. I think there might be questions, maybe?
Yes, there will be.
Are you lost, Mark? Are you coming up here? No? Okay. Oh, microphone.
He's just searching for the hand. That was excellent, Anne. Thank you.
Maybe people can just yell, Mark.
Supposedly.
We've found the microphone. Okay, yes! So, questions for Anne, please. Got time for a couple?
No.
No?
One up the
No?
back there?
No? Alira. Oh, Alira?
Okay, so it sounds like we need a whole overhaul of the whole system. So how do you see the first steps of that? Yeah, I realise that.
Yeah,
It's more practical.
this is part of it. I think really just having those conversations and not letting ourselves be trapped into only talking about the things the media or politicians are trying to tell us are important. I suppose it's more of a philosophical position that, we actually have to widen this out. Look at, instead, I often say when people present me with the results of a poll, I never believe them. When people say, oh, the things that people really care about are this, this, this and this, because I know that often when people are answering those surveys, the first thing that comes into your head is the thing you heard last news on TV that's kind of upset you or whatever. So you don't actually give a real honest answer from the gut. What's important to you? What do you know in your gut is not happening that should be happening? And I think we need to start examining ourselves around that and start talking about those things.
Thanks, Anne. Joa?
Hi Anna, I'm Joa. Thanks for your speech, it was great. I was wondering about your time in Get Up, and I was thinking about one of the things that we need to do is engage our younger people in politics, because obviously really important, they're obviously really disengaged. And I was wondering if you had any insights into how to engage them through your time with Get Up, and what kind of, if there is a large number of young people engaging with Get Up, or there isn't a large number of people young people engaging with Get Up.
Okay, actually first I should just correct something Mark said. I was actually not one of the founders of Get Up, I was one of the founders of Rural Australians for Refugees, and became involved in Get Up through that, and then have been on the board for quite a while and was chair for several years of Get Up. But yeah, I wasn't one of the founders of Get Up. It was interesting, when Get Up started, everyone assumed that the membership was kind of youngish, but in fact most of them were over 40 or over 50 even in those early years, because I think older people tend to often have more time to think about these things and to sit at their computers and fire off emails. But in recent years, actually, Get Up has become more successful at drawing in younger people. And I think it's partly because we started doing more things on the ground and having rallies and vigils and encouraging young people to get together and do stuff. I think that was really helpful. But I'm afraid it still seems to be a very small minority of young people who are politically engaged, and I actually don't really have an answer to how we change that. I'd love to see it happen. But yeah, unfortunately, even though I think Get Up's demographic has got younger, but it's still pretty small in terms of young people.
Just a quick announcement as well. I don't know if anyone saw the latest Get Up email, but there's another climate change rally being organised by the school kids, and they're inviting all the adults to join in this time. Yeah. Actually, so pay attention to that and get out on the streets. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. I do think that the schools going out for climate change, the kids going out for climate change, is one of the most exciting things that's happened in a very long time. And I think it's like the whole generation got skipped. A whole generation that kind of is too busy. What you might call late Generation X and Generation Y just kind of went AWOL, I think, on the political front. But this new generation coming through, with a bit of luck, is going to be engaged, because this issue is their issue. And they're not going to get engaged on this one. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
It's a comment, but I do have a suggestion, Anne, Bobby, here. No, here in the...
The light is right in my eye, sorry.
How to get young people involved. It's long term, but we've got to get citizens' juries into schools, which they're often quite willing to do. Get kids exercising democracy in schools, and also get civics education back into schools.
Yep.
And include it with maths, you know, about how if you have preference systems, so on.
It's always been astounded me how little time is spent during all those years of schooling and actually teaching students how to be citizens.
Yeah.
That won't help if they're ignorant.
So my question is sort of related to sort of Get Up involvement as well, I'm going to go along later today. Actually, they're organising these sort of Get Up phone-ins to try and actually target some electorates, and I think there's, you know, one of the things, as I'm sure you know, is that they're now surveying people, asking them to sort of suggest independent candidates that people, you know, that Get Up could support. And I mean, I think, you know, what Mark's doing here is an interesting sort of part of that that groundswell. I guess, like many people, I'm completely disillusioned by Labour, you know. But I guess for me, I need to kind of get over this sort of mindset I've had that independents tend to be kind of the loony right-wingers. You know, sorry, I'm not being very articulate, but I guess it's a question around how effective do we think independent progressives can be in our current parliament?
I just think the more voices, the better, and the more voices that are just saying what they believe and not just sprouting party policies from the major parties. I'm all for pluralism, so the more independents we get out there, the better. You know, it'd be very interesting to see what happens in the next election, how well independents do, because if there is a real groundswell to Labor, independents often don't do very well. But, you know, I think we need to start encouraging that range of voices, and that in itself will start to impact on the major parties, because we start getting more independents into Parliament. The major parties will see that there's actually some value in having genuine conversations with people and not just, you know, talking along set lines all the time. And I think one of the reasons that Get Up has decided to back independents in this election is the realisation that the whole system needs to be shaken up, because the two-party system, as we've had it, is just not working. And it's become so hugely unpopular that the whole system needs a shake-up, and independence is one way of doing that. How that would play out in the longer term, who knows? But at this stage, I feel that independents have a really important role to play in just presenting an authentic alternative.
Hello, I'm Cotty. Yes, I agree with you 100%, and it's because of the independents this vote went through. We defeated the, Liberal Party and Nationals in regards to the Medivac for the refugees. That was because of the minor parties and the independents voted alongside Labor. And I agree with you in regards to getting younger people engaged is having people like Mark and others who are inspirational, you know, because the people in charge right now are very, you know, I follow politics and I'm very uninspired by all of them, and I can imagine why it's just a joke to younger people. And I think if more independents that are able to cross the floor this way and that way for the best solution for the people is actually going to break that stalemate between the two major parties. And, you know, I
think they can also play a role of giving sort of dissident members of the major parties who feel uncomfortable with their party's policies, can give them confidence and give them a little kind of, oh, well, you know, these independents are doing it, maybe if we work together and maybe we could make... And that's exactly how the Medivac thing went through, really. So, you know, it does have an impact. I don't think it's like a wasted vote or whatever, having an independent there by any means. Anyone else? We're going to try and catch up time.
I think, sadly, Anne, the juggernaut of time needs to move on. If we could all thank Anne Coombs very much for her time.